Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Bentley. Welcome to the second oversupply webinar that I put on. I think I'm going to do these probably once a year, as I think it's a great place to answer all the questions I get at once and a great excuse to really think deeply about renewable integration. For anyone who accepted the meeting invite, I'll send this presentation to you, but if you didn't accept the meeting invite and just called in, you're going to have to email me to get a copy of the presentation. So all the usual disclaimers. If there are any reporters on the call, I'm happy to be on record. But if you hear anyone else in the background talking, or if someone asks a question, that's going to be off record. The views expressed are my own and do not necessarily represent my company, Gridwell Consulting, any of our clients, or any of the Western Power Trading Forum members. So a little bit about myself and Gridwell before I get started. I'm CEO of Gridwell Consulting. We work mostly in Western energy markets, and then we do ISO RTO market design outside of California. So that means most of our clients interact with the California ISO, and then we do work directly for other ISOs. We also have some clients in FCP, so you will hear us occasionally on their calls. The way most people know me on this call, the way most people in California know me, is because I represent the Western Power Trading Forum, or WPTF, at the CAISO committee. WPTF is a nonprofit trade organization, and really all they care about is encouraging non-discriminatory market policy, so encouraging competition and transparency across all Western markets. If you're interested in learning more about Gridwell or the CAISO committee, you could go to our website. And if you're interested more in my background, feel free to go to LinkedIn. Oversupply seems like it's a really big topic. And when I take a step back and think about why I get so many questions on this one issue, I think it's because oversupply really impacts almost every aspect of the market. It impacts energy market prices and generation dispatch. And I mean, it impacts all generation dispatch. So not just wind and solar, but also thermal generation and other generation types. It impacts contracts. I've done a lot of review of solar and wind contracts in the past couple of years. And it's been really fascinating to see how these contracts, they differ a little bit between entities, but really they differ across time. And we're going to talk a lot about contracting and the implications of oversupply and curtailment types on these renewable contracts. Lately, too, I've been getting a lot of questions about EIM expansion, and there's definitely a narrative where you can connect to the benefits of expansion to oversupply. And the greater amounts of oversupply, in some ways, you get more and more benefits of having a broader regionalized stakeholder community that can really assess the benefits of expansion and assess how well we can integrate these renewables across a broader region. And then, of course, the oversupply impacts reliability, and everyone cares about that. Everyone wants the lights on. Everyone knows we're integrating a lot of renewables over the next 12 years and beyond, a lot. So I'm not going to spend any time showing the increase in renewables or the increase in behind-the-meter solar, for example. Oversupply, though, is one way to assess how well California is integrating renewable energy. The thing is, what is causing small amounts of oversupply now will end up causing larger and larger amounts over time if we don't inherently fix the fundamental issues that are causing the oversupply. So I think it's really important to take a step back after we've had about 2 years now of pretty high renewables on our system to say what is working, what is not working, and importantly, what do we need to think about as we transition to 100% renewables? So in this presentation, it's really built on the 2017 oversupply presentation that I did. If you get the presentation, you can click this link here and you can find that, or you could email me. I'd be happy to send you a link to that presentation. So there's some repeat material, but I try not to repeat too much in here and really focus on new elements. So the first part of this presentation is how the CAISO market optimization handles oversupply. I'm going to talk about some new things about curtailment types and how operators are handling renewable integration, and talk a little bit more about EIM than I did last year. This part is a little bit wonkish, I'm going to warn you, but it's really important when we think about renewable integration over time, and then we think about regionalization. So I'm going to walk through kind of the details of the market optimization, but then I'm going to try really hard to tell you why you care about that. In part 2 of this, I'm going to talk about what's impacting curtailment levels and just show a few insights that we've learned anyway from 2018. And then finally, I'm going to just give a few initial thoughts on how I think we could improve the market and think about improving the market as we transition toward this new future. I spend a lot of time for WPTF. Sometimes I'm afraid on a soapbox a bit, talking about policies that I think really need to happen. So I'm not going to do that here. But what I am going to do is try and connect how the market optimization works with what we're seeing in curtailments and say, okay, we know these things. So here are the policy and here are the policies and here are the tools that we could use to really decrease curtailment as we move forward. Well, part 1, oversupply impact on prices updated. So the first thing we need to talk about is what oversupply even is. Oversupply isn't really a standardized term, so I think it's important to talk about what do we even mean by oversupply. So what I think is a great definition of oversupply is that it is a condition that generally reflects a situation where resources that are willing to pay to generate or be paid $0 are dispatched downward. So if you have a solar resource that's saying, I will pay demand money if you just let me generate, and you have to back them down, we're in oversupply conditions. Oversupply and curtailment can occur in either the day-ahead or real-time market. And this is important to remember because what that means is that financially, when you get into these really extreme oversupply conditions, such that it shows up in the day-ahead, that has a much bigger impact on the market than if you just have a little bit of oversupply in the real time. And the reason why that is because the CAISO does most of their setup and most things are financially settled in the day ahead, and then they're only incrementally resettled in the real-time market. So real-time market really matters for things like tracking actual renewable production and these incremental prices. Sometimes there's a lot more price spikes in real time. But when you start talking about oversupply in the day ahead, that's when you really get the potential for these huge market changes. Curtailment can occur because of many different things. Generally, people talk about the first two, which is just supply-demand imbalance or grid economics. But there's a new type of curtailment that we're starting to talk about, and that has to do with grid operator expectations. And this has popped up in 2018, so I'm going to spend a few slides talking about that. How is oversupply measured? Well, it's measured through something called curtailment. Really, curtailment is shorthand for the California ISO backing down solar and wind energy. You could also argue that there's pre-curtailment, so resources that choose not to participate in the market and they back themselves down because they know what the market prices will be. Hydro spill would be an example of this kind of pre-curtailment. But we're not going to talk about that because it's not very visible to me anyway. You'd have to go to a company that specializes in hydro to really understand that a little bit more. So our focus here is on CAISO curtailment. So when the CAISO reports on curtailment, they define this as the difference between actual production and the forecast when the production is less than the forecast. That's kind of a mouthful. That's their technical definition. It's interesting to note that they define curtailment as the difference between instantaneous production and their forecast, which is a forecast, the 5-minute forecast. That's not what the resource is actually capable of. Only in the past few months has the CAISO said that they're going to report on this new definition of curtailment. And that's the difference between actual production and the capability of the wind or solar resource to produce. So again, the first one is based on forecast, and most of the curtailment reports that you see today, actually all the curtailment reports that you see today is based on this first definition, but very soon we're going to start seeing curtailment reports based on this new definition that revolves around capability rather than forecast of capability. Now I'm going to go over the different curtailment types, and you may be thinking this is overkill. Why do you care about all these different curtailment types? Curtailment is curtailment. Well, curtailment is most decidedly not curtailment when you're talking about impacts on the market and market prices. So if you have, for example, a local self-schedule curtailment, this has very different implications on reliability, and it has very different implications on market prices than, for example, a system economic curtailment. So we're going to walk through these so you could really get a feel for what these different curtailment prices mean for curtailment of your own resources and then market prices. The one thing I want to highlight on this slide is the operator intervention curtailment type. Full disclosure, I made up the term operator intervention. There is a new curtailment type, but it does not have an official name yet. Last year, since last year, the CAISO has clarified that they have tariff authority for grid operator curtailment. That is a completely separate thing than exceptional dispatch. And I'm going to talk about that more specifically. But just know I made up this word, operator intervention. I've kind of tried to make it a thing, but it's totally possible that 2 months from now, the CAISO is going to come out with a report with a totally different name. So if you see a new curtailment type being reported on, this is probably the one that they're doing. It's just they picked a new name than the one I randomly gave it. So we could sort these curtailment types into 2 buckets. The first one you could think about is something that the market optimization has done. So the market optimization will decide based on economics whether to curtail wind and solar resources. And these are called economic or self-scheduled curtailments. So this is for resources that are either economically offered in at a price, or they self-scheduled their energy into the market as a price taker. The market optimization may naturally, because of grid conditions, curtail these resources. These are called economic or self-scheduled curtailments. Now, same thing, resources have economically or self-scheduled into the market. The CAISO operator may decide to curtail these resources. But if an operator, if a human being decides to curtail them, that's an exceptional dispatch curtailment or an operator curtailment. For the next, 4 or 5 slides, we're going to really focus on the market optimization. And I could see by the list of people on the webinar, a lot of you are really familiar with optimization, but some people on the call aren't. So I'm just going to level set right here. The market optimization is what the CAISO uses to ensure reliability. They had a tagline that I loved a few years ago, and it was called reliability through markets. And that was what the CAISO did to ensure supply met demand at the lowest cost. So what the market optimization is just a giant cost minimization problem. It solves supply equaling demand at the lowest cost, subject to probably tens of thousands of constraints. You have individual resource constraints, for example, that get really into the weeds, right? The nitty gritty. The market optimization has to ensure, for example, that each resource characteristic is respected. An example of this would be a combined cycle resource having a 4-hour minimum online time. So you can see it's a very complex equation, but it still is just math and it still is just an equation. So the optimization will manage congestion using 2 main value types. You have economic offers, and this is between the bid floor of -$150 per megawatt hour and the bid cap of $1,000 per megawatt hour. I'm being a little wishy-washy on the cap. FERC technically rules that it needs to be $1,000 or actual cost, but it's just much easier to think of the cap as $1,000 per megawatt hour. So you have these economic offers, and the optimization uses these. Then you also have something called a penalty factor, and these are assigned parameter costs. Self-scheduled resources are price takers, thus they're assigned this penalty factor. And all sorts of resources and transmission assets and constraints are assigned a penalty factor. And the reason why the optimization does this is even if you are a resource and you self-schedule in, your resource still has value and it still has relative value compared to other constraints and other resources. And again, it's just a giant math problem, and math means numbers. So the CAISO has to assign you some sort of rank order, and this rank order is done through penalty factors. So you could think about it as an economic offer is a resource saying, here's what I think my relative value is. A penalty factor is the CAISO assigning that resource a relative value. If you guys knew me when I worked at the CAISO, you'll know that all my presentations had lots of figures and pictures in them. So this presentation is no different. From here on out, it's a lot more pictures and graphs and charts. So what this picture is, or it shows the offer cap at the top, $1,000 per megawatt hour, and it goes to the offer floor and then it goes down. So what this is, it's just kind of a very basic depiction of the market optimization. And you could see that, you have your offer floor to your offer cap, and there are negative economic energy offers, and there are positive energy offers. And it's this space, I'm not quite sure what color this is, teal maybe. It's in this teal space that typically people are really comfortable with. When people are less comfortable with is from the offer floor downward. And that's because beneath the offer floor, you get into these penalty factors or penalty prices. So you'll see the negative 155 here. When we translate this into curtailment, you'll see that from the offer floor to the offer cap, that's economic curtailment. And then beneath the offer floor, this is when self-schedule curtailment occurs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow up just this bottom part here, the part beneath 150, and really get into what happens here. And again, I want to be clear, right now we're mostly seeing economic curtailment. But as we transition to a 100% renewable future, we're going to begin to see more and more self-schedule curtailment. And it's really important to understand what's going on once we've run through all the economic bids. So once we are in oversupply conditions and the CAISO is back down, every little bit of economic offers you can, the first thing they do is they relax the power balance constraint. So they relax their parameter constraint in the optimization that says supply has to equal demand. The reason why they do this is because, remember, they balance supply and demand every 5 minutes. But in real time, in the instantaneous supply-demand balance, things can change. So there's a product, an ancillary service called regulation that the CAISO can actually lean on. So what the CAISO will do is they'll relax that power balance constraint by up to 10% of the regulation requirement. So that's technically what happens. Putting this in another perspective, however, what the CAISO has done by making that choice is that they've made a trade-off between reliability and between oversupply. So essentially, they have traded off allowing renewables to produce a little bit more with relaxing their regulation a little bit. So that's a trade-off between reliability and renewables at the most basic level. In this case, they have allowed renewables to generate a little bit more and allowed them to relax their reliability a little bit. I would like to note that there's no engineering analysis here. There was nothing that was done from a very technical perspective to pick this 10% number. That was a value choice that the CAISO made. So we're in oversupply conditions, and we've relaxed the power balance constraint, and there's still oversupply. Well, then what happens? Then the CAISO starts going into something called EIM, downward available capacity. This is them leaning on the fact that EIM entities are required to preserve a certain amount of downward available capacity in their market. So once the CAISO has leaned on their own internal regulation, in oversupply conditions, then they go to the EIM entities and they start having them back down their own available capacity in the down direction. Again, this is a value choice. This is saying that they're not going to preserve the EIM downward available capacity. Instead, they're going to allow more renewables to generate energy. Well, then let's say there's nothing that EIM can back down anymore. Only at that point will the CAISO begin to cut renewables. And even then, there's still a value judgment on which renewables to cut. It's really important to note that although everything is done by economics, the assigned penalty parameter is what's indicating the value. And then within each category, within each resource that's set by this penalty factor, that's when economics comes into play again. So for example, we've now hit the price taker supply bid. I don't know why it's called this price taker supply bid. What they really mean here is a real-time self-schedule. So renewables that did not bid into the IFM or the day-ahead market and just came in real time and self-scheduled, these are the renewables that the CAISO is going to cut first. Now, there could be thousands upon thousands of renewables in this bucket. Let's say there's 5,000 megawatts of renewables in this bucket, but the CAISO only needs to curtail 200 megawatts. You may then ask, okay, who do they decide to curtail? Is it pro rata? It's not. It used to be pro rata a long, long time ago, but now the market optimization does it. So the first way the market optimization does it is they cut based on effectiveness factor. And then after that, so they look at the resources, they say, okay, who is going to relieve the constraints the most such that it maintains that cost minimization balance, or maintains it, that helps the cost minimization. So if I cut X resource over Y resource, what are the market economic impacts of that? So first, they cut based on the effectiveness factor. And now let's say there are two resources that have the same effectiveness factor. Then they go to losses. And then after that, they'll go to something called pro rata. Pro rata does not mean pro rata. Pro rata means random. And this does happen sometimes. So if you're an asset owner and you notice that in extreme oversupply conditions, the CAISO tends to flip back and forth between your two resources to curtail them. That's because your resources probably are located really close to each other and they have the same effectiveness factor and losses. And rather than doing a small haircut of each, essentially optimization is just randomly choosing one resource to cut. So after we go through all our real-time self-schedules, only then will the CAISO begin to cut resources that self-scheduled in the IFM. And then after that, well, somewhat concurrently to that, the CAISO may lean on the power balance constraint for each EIM entity. You'll notice that IFM schedule and power balance constraint for each EIM entity have the same penalty factor. So what that means is that the CAISO's market optimization will essentially relax the power balance constraint or cut IFM self-schedules based on what's most economic to do. I'll note here again that this is a choice. The CAISO has decided to cut all IFM renewables, cut all real-time self-schedules before making this economic trade-off between day-ahead renewables and power balance constraints for EIM entity. They could make a different value choice. You could have leaned on the CAISO's power balance constraint and then the EIM power balance constraint before going into everything else. You could have done EIM downward available capacity and then relaxed the power balance constraint for EIM areas before cutting any renewables. These are not necessarily engineering decisions, but value judgments. So when we start talking about penalty parameters, it's really important to note that this is not something that stakeholders should have no input in. This is actually a really big policy detail that deserves a discussion at a higher level. And unfortunately, most initiatives don't talk about these value judgments and penalty parameters. This is kind of usually tucked aside in a more technical appendix or a technical process. So as we extend the day-ahead market to EIM entities, or eventually as the CAISO regionalizes, I think it'll be really important to start talking about these value judgments and not talk about them in a way that prohibits stakeholder participation. Because it may be tough for some people to talk about penalty factors, but I don't think it's hard for anyone to talk about value judgments between adjusting renewable schedules and how much we should rely on the regulation requirement. That's much more intuitive. Okay, so far already, we've been talking about penalties parameters, which is simply just has to do with scheduling. Who gets cut when, how much we lean on these different reliability factors. But there's also some big impacts on market prices. That's my next slide. So here you'll see the same generalized image of the market optimization again, but now on the right-hand side, you'll see the market prices that arise from these different penalty factors. So again, the teal is pretty intuitive. When you have economic curtailment, when resources are bidding a negative value, you'll see the price anywhere between 0 and negative 150. Very practically, however, in 2018, we've seen economic curtailment somewhere beneath negative $20 per megawatt hour. You could actually draw a curve that goes from $20 to about $5, and it's pretty smooth across all the negative intervals. When you start getting into cutting renewables that have self-scheduled and the different prices that occur from leaning on regulation or leaning on the EIM areas, though, you start to get really kind of wonky prices. I've looked into this a little bit more since I did this presentation last year, and I'm not convinced that this is the best way to do it or that this is actually what would occur if we were ever to cut that many renewables. The problem is, since some of these parameters have been implemented, we haven't had these deep self-schedule cuts. We haven't been in oversupply conditions where we really need to test this. However, this is why it's so important to talk about now, because as we get to 100% renewables, we absolutely will see these really high oversupply conditions where you would end up doing such deep curtailments. So this becomes really important. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through it one by one. I might do some flipping, hopefully it doesn't bother people. So now, when you go to this power balance constraint, the scheduling one price, so the penalty factor, is negative $155 per megawatt hour. And that's actually how it's priced as well in the market. So if you ever see a price of negative $155, you'll know that the CAISO has relaxed its power balance constraint. Then when the CAISO starts leaning on that EIM, downward available capacity, that ends up being priced at that downward capacity's market prices or their default energy bid if there's market power going on. And only then, if the CAISO begins to cut renewables, then it goes back to negative $150. I don't know that this is intuitive or if this is the outcome that the CAISO was going for. I think this definitely bears closer examination. Ideally, I think from a incentive perspective, what would happen is the greater the oversupply condition, the more negative the prices would be. And the reason for this is because negative prices are a signal to the market. It's a signal to load, it's a signal to supply, and it really influences not just resource behavior, but eventually the resource fleet. For example, it will really matter to storage whether the price is set at a market price from the EIM downward capacity or a deeply negative price. That is absolutely the difference between a storage resource thriving in the market or not being able to survive on energy rent. Ideally, what would happen is that the market would signal the types of resources it needs. So this is, again, why I'm not sure if this will actually happen, but it definitely bears closer inspection. This is my last slide on the pricing impacts of market curtailment. So now we're going to go on to non-market curtailment. So there's two general types, as I said, of this non-market curtailment, and this is curtailment done by human beings, by actual CAISO operators. So you have exceptional dispatch curtailment, which is a dispatch instruction by the CAISO to curtail their output, to decrease their output. If you get curtailed, you cannot set the LMP. If you have an exceptional dispatch to increase your supply, you also can't set the LMP. And there's also operator curtailment. Please remember, I'm making up this word, operator curtailment. But what it is, it's an operating instruction for two specifically solar and wind resources to not generate higher than their schedule. And in the case of wind and solar resources, their schedule is their forecast. So it's an operating instruction which must be followed according to the CAISO tariff for renewables not to generate higher than their forecast. There's been, it was a little contentious to get this one through, I'm going to be honest. The problem is a lot of wind and solar resources do not have the physical capability to limit their output. They can't limit it to a forecast. They can't follow a 5-minute dispatch signal. So the idea that they'd have to just, limit their output really isn't acknowledging their limitations. That said, the CAISO did add some wiggle room in their tariff language, so it's definitely not a tariff violation if you're incapable of following a 5-minute schedule. That said, they really would like renewables, when they're told to, when they get this operator curtailment order, to shut down. The problem with this is, from a market perspective, is that there are some boundaries on this. For example, the CAISO says they should use up all economic bids before issuing this operational curtailment. That's a solid boundary. In reality, that doesn't happen, and I don't think it can happen. So I'm going to tell you why. in real time, when there's operator curtailment, the reason why is because they're curtailing due to their expectations of the future. And the real-time market optimization only looks out 4.5 hours. So if it's 8 a.m. and you're an operator and you're really concerned about high oversupply conditions in the middle of the day, the optimization literally doesn't look out that far. So there's no way to use up economic bids. And the CAISO operators don't trust the market optimization enough to rely on it and wait to see if it will use up all economic bids and then if more curtailment will be needed. So instead, what we saw this year was operators calling up resources and limiting their output well in advance of the actual operating hour. So this means some resources, unfortunately, were curtailed all day long on some weekends. And now I know that because these resources called me up and said, what is going on? What rule allows the CAISO to curtail us? But no one else really knows this except for the CAISO because it's not transparent at all. So this has been an issue a bit more this year. Luckily, the CAISO did go through a policy. They did commit to making these operator curtailments transparent. And then this was re-emphasized with the board, and the board asked that the CAISO really ensure that this is transparent. I think it's important for transparency because there's two reasons why I could see operators curtailing. One is because there's something fundamentally wrong with the market optimization and they need to make up for that lapse. Or two, just ad hoc, sometimes something happens and they rely on it. Now, if it's the latter, I am completely fine with operator curtailments, and I think everyone is. I think everyone respects that sometimes things happen, and that's why we have grid operators and not just total reliance on the market optimization. It's the first one, though, and there's a fundamental issue with the market optimization that operators are making up for. The only way we'll ever know this is if we make these curtailments transparent, and then people can go in and say, hey, what's wrong with optimization? And then we fix it. And we fix it well in advance of, 100% renewables. I'm only going to talk very briefly now about local and system curtailment. I started to do a bigger section on local and system curtailment, but I quickly got myself all ramped up and a little bit angry. So I decided that wasn't a positive enough thing to add these slides. So I'll explain why. So system curtailment implies an excess of supply across the whole grid. So that's just supply is greater than demand and there's no transmission constraints. Local curtailment implies that there's transmission congestion and supply cannot reach demand. So this shows up in the LMP in two different ways, which makes it really easy if you're tracking prices to know whether there's system curtailment or local curtailment. So if you guys all remember, LMP equals energy plus congestion plus losses. System curtailment will show up in the energy component of the LMP. Local curtailment, on the other hand, will show up in the congestion component of the LMP. And you'll see very frequently that the congestion component will get way more negative than the energy component. If you're interested in exactly why that is, you could go back and you could listen to my 2017 presentation where I explained the technicalities of that in a lot more detail. So the reason why I get really ramped up talking about local and system curtailment is because when you start talking about transmission congestion, you naturally need to talk about, well, why isn't there enough transmission for renewable supply to get to the demand? And right now, it's not that big of an issue. We're not seeing it that frequently, but we're also only planning to a 30% reliability standard within our transmission planning process with the CAISO. This is not the fault of the California ISO, I should say. Not completely their fault anyway. Some people may argue with me. I'm going to go out there and say it's not their fault. So the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, are supposed to transmit renewable portfolios for the CAISO to use in their transmission planning process. So the CPUC says, here's where the renewables are going to be built. Here's the percentage. CAISO makes sure there's enough transmission. CPUC has not transferred any 50% renewable portfolios. So that means the CAISO can do all the planning and special studies they want, but they're not actually allowed to authorize transmission for a 50% scenario or authorize building of transmission and rate recovery or any of that at this moment. They are literally stuck waiting for the CPUC. The California ISO board at the last meeting specifically mentioned that this was a big deal and asked that the CAISO pressure on the CPUC. You know, the CPUC, they're trying to do a new integrated resource plan. It takes a while, I understand, but it's extremely frustrating to know that we're in a situation where we know we're transitioning to 100% renewables, and instead we're still planning to 33%. And I just went on and talked about what I was not going to talk about, and I apologize. I'm just going to show you this slide now. And you can see that already we're having local curtailment just as much as system curtailment. So it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue very soon. So what this chart is you have months on the bottom, you see 2017 and 2018, and then on the y-axis you have megawatt hours. So this is monthly variable energy resource, monthly solar and wind curtailment in the 5-minute market, and it's just broken into was it a local curtailment or was it a system curtailment? Okay, now we're going to go on to just a few summary slides before getting to the next section. So this is just a summary of curtailment impact on market prices, taking it to the highest level. So if you have economic curtailment, you're going to have negative prices between $0 and negative $150 per megawatt hour. If it's a self-scheduled curtailment, it's going to be negative $150 per megawatt hour. But as you recall, if you lean on the power balance constraint or EIM, those have different prices as well. Then both exceptional dispatch and operator intervention, these are going to be unpriced in the market. We can also break up curtailment types by how they appear in contracts. So this is very interesting because there's a giant disconnect between what you see contractually and what you see at the California ISO. So contractually, most often I see two terms, economic curtailment and reliability curtailment. And very often, asset owners will be paid differently based on the type of curtailment. And I should note, I've seen contracts across the West and across SPP that use these terms. So economic curtailment and reliability curtailment, the issue with using these terms is, to me, they're not defined and they're not very clear. Some things I think are pretty clearly in each category. For example, economic curtailment at the CAISO, where you're curtailing a bid that is economically offered in, I think that's pretty clearly in the economic curtailment bucket. A self-scheduled curtailment, on the other hand, I could make the argument either way. I could say that a self-scheduled curtailment is completely done through the market optimization. It's completely done through economics, so belongs in that economic curtailment bucket. I could also make the counter argument that says the CAISO is curtailing that many self-schedules. They're going to run into a reliability issue, and they're really doing that because there are reliability concerns. If you overload a transmission line, there's clearly a reliability element to that. So you could also argue that self-scheduled curtailments belong in the reliability curtailment bucket. And now if you get paid differently from an economic curtailment and reliability curtailment, suddenly that question where self-scheduled curtailment belongs becomes really important. We're not seeing much self-scheduled curtailment now, but we absolutely will see that in the future. That means that the CAISO should be really clear about which bucket self-scheduled curtailment belongs into, or maybe take a different tack and break up curtailment a different way within the penalty factors. The thing is, unless stakeholders ask the CAISO to do that, they're not going to do that on their own because the CAISO has no insight into contracting. The CAISO doesn't review renewable contracts. They don't even know about the different terms of renewable contracts because that's not their business. So if you care about these things, it's really important to advocate towards the CAISO. Obviously, this is what my consulting company does a lot of the time. And this is something that I think the Western Power Trading Forum may pick up in the next few months. But again, if no one asks us to do it, we're probably not going to. So please, if you care about these things, get engaged. All right, sorry, that was my get engaged side note. You'll hear that a lot from me. I really believe fundamentally that the more stakeholders that are involved in the policy process, the better. Okay, so I just want to mention one more thing on this slide, and that's there's an overgeneration procedure, 2390, and I think very clearly that's the overgen procedure. That's an operating procedure that clearly falls in the reliability curtailment bucket. Now we're going to talk about some takeaways. I hope in this section you now understand pretty clearly how oversupply impacts market prices and how different types of curtailments and the depth of curtailment will impact the different market prices. I hope you also see that there's no standard definition for curtailment types and that it probably should be fixed. The next thing I hope that I've made clear is how EIM entities and how even having an EIM can help integrate renewables in California, even during these extreme oversupply conditions. I think it's pretty intuitive that EIM can help renewable integration simply by having a broader base over which to optimize. But I think it's sometimes less intuitive and we missed out on these more nuanced benefits of EIM. And I think as more and more entities decide whether to join or not, it's these nuanced benefits that deserve some attention, especially as Oregon and Washington and a lot of the West go toward, these high renewable goals. And then I also hope that you guys see that the CAISO, when they're doing curtailment, they're doing it in an efficient and reliable manner. Curtailment is not necessarily a bad thing. Really, the CAISO is just doing its job most of the time, especially when you're getting into economic curtailment. But I also think we need to think and talk about more openly how the optimization is making trade-offs between reliability and renewables and EIM. I truly do believe that this deserves a policy discussion. And then I also think they need to clarify curtailment. I've said it a lot, but I'm going to say that again. They should really clarify what the word curtailment means before we have massive contract disputes in California. Okay, on to part 2. So thanks for hanging with me through my market optimization talk. From now on, we're just going to talk about what happened in 2018, and we're going to go back to 2017 a little bit and make some comparisons. So let's go back to 2017. This is a table, bar chart, that shows day-ahead prices in January through June 2017. And I believe this is when oversupply started getting the most attention. So what this chart shows is the x-axis is hours and the y-axis is percent of hours. And you could see, for example, that the light blue is the price from $0 to $1, and then there's 0 to -5, and then -5 to -10, and then there's a typo, sorry about that, that should be -10 to -15. So you could see, for example, that in hour 13, almost 20% of the hours had prices that were very low or negative, and this is in the day-ahead market. The reason why that's so surprising is because the day-ahead market optimizes over all 24 hours. And so to have negative prices or really low prices for that significant amount of time is pretty amazing. That means there's a lot of renewables being generated and a lot of resources that are either self-scheduling in or physically unable to be backed down. Also in 2015, you could see a pretty big impact on the depth of prices in the real-time market. So now we're looking at real-time 15-minute market prices. And you could see for the first time in 2017 that in Q1, you really got these very negative prices below $50 and in fact, all the way beneath negative 145. And you saw this for a lot of intervals. So these are percent of 15-minute intervals over the entire day. So solar doesn't shine at night, and you still see that almost in 10% of the intervals, there were negative prices in Q1 2017. When we now look at what the CAISO did in 2018 in response to this, we see a little bit of change, but most of the change just happened naturally. So the first thing I want to highlight is that the CAISO introduced persistency-based VER forecasting. So again, variable energy resource forecasting. So they changed the way they forecasted wind and solar output. This reduced real-time forecast error, and this was implemented in April 2018. Something that didn't change, I mentioned here, and that's the underscheduling of wind and day ahead. So for some reason, a lot of wind just comes into real time, and it's not settled in the day ahead market. That has not improved. Hydro generation overall was down by 1,500 megawatts, but that doesn't tell the whole story. This is because reservoirs were higher, but this is only 8% of hydro. It's the run of rivers, and this is the hydro that self-schedules into the market that was lower. So it's interesting that we have these two very broad types of hydro generation, and they act very differently in the market. And so they have very different impacts on renewable integration. Fundamentally, you need hydro, which is a huge portion of not just California load. It's also huge in the Pacific Northwest. You really want hydro to respond to economic signals. That's what you want. But, hydro has a lot of physical constraints, so it can't do this, unfortunately. So that's something that I talk about a little bit more in the presentation. And then we had a little bit, let's see, what do we have? Oh, we had additional EIM and fee participation. We had both Idaho and PowerX join. So you see here, we had some new things in 2018, but there was no fundamental shift in rules. There was no introduction of a new market product. Not a lot changed in some ways. But we did see differences in both the amount of wind and solar generation and curtailment. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the next few slides. So what this slide shows is that in every single month, we had increased wind and solar generation in 2018 compared to 2017. You'll see on the left-hand side, that's total megawatt hours. And you'll see that from January through July, which is the last point I had data for, 2018 wind and solar was higher. I also added the percentages here because I thought it didn't show how big of a jump it was in the bar charts very well. In February, that's a 35% increase in wind and solar generation, which is pretty big. So when I first did this chart, I then thought, okay, I would expect to see curtailments decrease in every single month, but that's not what I saw at all. So this is that same chart, but instead of charting renewable output, this is CAISO curtailment in 2017 and 2018. And what you see here is the CAISO curtailed less in every month except for March and May in the spring. And this was surprising to me. So Callie Wells is a partner with me at Gridwell Consulting. We put together a few more charts and we really looked into negative 5-minute prices, and we looked at kind of percentage increases over time. So I'm going to try and explain to you, what really is going on in 2018 compared to 2017. But at first, we were quite confused because this was this is frankly not what we expected to see. The next chart is on negative 5-minute prices, which is also what we didn't expect to see. You'll see here that in every month except for May, there were less 5-minute prices in intervals. So explain that a little badly, so I'll try again. So on the x-axis, you'll see months, and then on the y-axis, that's percent of real-time intervals. So it's the percent of 5-minute intervals. So you'll see in March, for example, almost 20% of intervals were negative, whereas in 2018, it was more like 7.5%. That's a huge decrease in negative 5-minute prices. The thing to remember, though, is that when I'm talking about negative 5-minute prices here, I'm only talking about the energy component of the LMP. So if you go back to what we were talking about earlier with the difference between system and local curtailment, remember, local curtailment is in the congestion component. System curtailment is in the energy component of the LMP. So now we're only looking at negative 5-minute prices on the energy component. So if you go here, so look at March here and look at March here. So in March, there were increased curtailments in 2018, but decreased negative 5-minute intervals. So what that says is that there was increased curtailment, but they're all in a local area. So this is why understanding the curtailment types and their impact on the market really matters. Because if you just see something that says negative 5-minute prices, you have decreased, you might think that curtailment has decreased. And that's not necessarily true. It matters what prices they're showing, and it matters whether you're talking about curtailment in a local area or system area. So this chart looks at the frequency of negative 5-minute prices. So again, we're talking about the system marginal energy price, and we're looking at it by month. So the frequency of negative prices, but then it shows the depth of the negative price. So what you just see here basically is we didn't have that low prices. They were negative, but they weren't that negative. So not as many intervals and not as negative overall. What that means is from a system level, we didn't have the same type of system oversupply where we just, across the grid had too many renewable energies for demand. So now let's bucket this by percentage. And the reason why we did this is because we know we're transitioning to 100% renewables. We know 50% is coming, which means the CAISO is going to see a higher and higher percentage of load served by renewables. So on this x-axis, that's exactly what you see. You see the percent of load served by renewables in these 10% buckets, and then greater than 50%. This is not percent of load served by wind and solar. It's by all renewables that meet the RPS standard. On the left-hand side, you see megawatt hour. And so what this is showing you is the amount of wind and solar curtailments in absolute terms, 5% of load served by renewables. And so you'll see that over time, and the 20% to 40 to 50% bucket all the way through, there was a decrease in CAISO curtailment in 2018. And then in the greater than 50%, we saw a big jump. So the CAISO increased the absolute number of curtailments when more than 50% of load was served by renewables. When you look at this, though, it's not really fair to look at the absolute amount of curtailment. That absolutely matters. But when you're talking about how well the CAISO is integrating renewables, when you keep adding renewables to the system, naturally you're going to have an increase in curtailment. So the next chart we did normalizes this in a way. So what it looks at is as the percent of load served by renewable increases, what happens to the percent of wind and solar generation curtailed? So now it's looking at the percent of wind and solar curtailed, which is how much wind and solar is curtailed over the total amount of wind and solar generation. So what you see now is a really clean pattern where over time, the percent of load served by renewables has an absolute connection to the percent of wind and solar generation curtailed, and it looks like there's almost an exponential increase. That means that the CAISO is curtailing renewables or curtailing wind and solar at an increasing rate, the more load is served by renewables. There's another implication from the slide as well when you pair it from the slide before. So if you recall here, in the greater than 50% bucket, you'll note that the 2018 curtailment was higher than 2017. But if you look at it by percentage, it's lower. What the implication of that is the CAISO got more efficient at integrating renewables between 2017 and 2018. Now, when I say the CAISO got more efficient, I mean it very broadly. I don't necessarily mean the CAISO changed the market rules to make it more efficient. I just mean something changed to allow more renewables as a percentage on the system. I thought I might get a cooler answer and have a cooler reveal here, but I think it's just hydro, I'm gonna be honest. I have a few more slides on what could have changed, but I'm pretty sure it's just hydro generation decreased. This slide, I got this from a guy named Jeff at Energy GPS. Energy GPS has the best data. They also they have a free newsletter that I really like, and then they have different products. I also subscribe to all their reports related to the ISO markets around the country. I highly recommend them if you need data or are interested in really the nitty-gritty details about curtailment, or even, I think they have an oversupply, a full report out right now as well. So I got this from Jeff. What this shows is in May, the total CAISO hydro being much, much lower every single day in 2018 compared to 2017. So I think that's the reason. If you think about it, this hydro was self-scheduling in, and so every megawatt higher in 2017 than 2018, that was a megawatt that was competing against solar and wind energy. So when you reduce that, you really were able to integrate more wind and solar. The next slide shows self-scheduled imports. This slide is presented at the Market Performance and Planning Forum meeting that occurs at the CAISO every 6 weeks. It's a little messy, but I think it has a lot of good information. So you see from 2016 to 2018, the amount of megawatts that were self-scheduled or bid in that were imports and exports. So if we just concentrate on the top half, you'll see that there are a lot of self-scheduled imports. And the amount has started to change a little bit in 18, but it's still fairly consistent, even when compared to 2016 when there were no negative prices. So you see this, I wish I had a line I could draw across, but you see this line is pretty consistent, and there remains a significant amount of self-scheduled imports. That said, you'll see here, look, there's a little bit more price responsiveness, and when you look at individual days, you see this as well. So I think this can explain some of the additional efficiency in integrating renewables in 2018. EIM could be its own presentation here, so I'm just going to drop this slide in here and say, look, there are robust energy transfers in March through May, and that most certainly helped to integrate renewables and helped avoid some of the oversupply events. The next slide shows the real-time average system marginal energy price, February through May, and it's just an average. This really is just to get a view on the differences between 2018 and 2017. And again, we're bucketing it by percent of load served by renewables. So what you see is there really was this pretty drastic shift between 2017 and 2018. You'll note in 2017, when there was more than 50% of load served by renewables, the price was negative. So here's $0 right here. And you'll see that the average price was underneath that. That's pretty incredible for the average price to be negative, because that means that within every single interval, even the higher priced intervals, it's still averaging out to a negative number. This certainly was not true in 2018, although it did stay pretty low. I know you're all thinking right now, by the way, I know you're not listening to me and you're just looking at what looks like a data error in the 20 to 30% bucket. I don't know. I thought it was a data error too. Both Callie and I checked this twice though, and if it's a data error, it's a data error on the CAISO's part. So it's not the exact same point here. In 2017, it was $28.12, and in 2018, it was $28.22. So I don't know, it's a weird coincidence, but that is what the data is, and it's not an error on our part anyway. Now we're going to get into some takeaways. So I think the takeaways are pretty easy here. You know, low snowpack made it easier for renewables to produce, and it made it easier for the CAISO to integrate them. We had less oversupply, and so market prices were higher. I also think we can see that the level of curtailment significantly impacts market prices. That's pretty clear. And then I think 2018 is the first time we could really say there's a pattern. When we looked at this in 2017, you know, 1 year does not a pattern make. So 2018 really revealed that there's going to be exponential wind and solar curtailments as additional load is served by renewables. And I think this exponential pattern in some ways is really intuitive, because if you curtail a solar or wind resource in one interval, you could, as soon as you have that curtailment, if you keep everything else equal, you could build as much solar and wind as you want, but that interval is already saturated. There's already enough supply. So building more and more supply will just mean more and more curtailment in that interval, everything else held equal. And then again, everything else held equal, not only will there be more curtailment in that interval, but there'll be more supply, more oversupply in other intervals, and in other intervals that didn't previously have oversupply. So really this exponential curtailment is a pretty natural implication if you don't change your underlying resource fleet and you don't change your underlying incentives to get people to bid differently. And of course, speaking of incentives and changes, that's our next section, just some very brief thoughts on policy. I think you'll be happy to know I am not showing you the duck curve here. Instead, I'm just showing you 1 day. I actually think that while the duck curve is great, if you want to talk about low-hanging fruit and some policy implications, it's really nice just to start out with 1 day where curtailment occurred, because I think it shows people pretty intuitively what's going on. So what this is showing on the bottom, sorry, there's no x-axis labeled, so this is just 1 day. So this is 5-minute data for an entire day. And on the left-hand side, you have megawatt hours. So the dark gray is nuclear generation, and the light gray is thermal. Then you have large hydro, and then imports. Then you have RPS, that's not wind and solar, so that's just other renewables category. This bright red line now is net load curve, which is the CAISO's definition of net load, which is load minus wind minus solar. The light green is wind, the yellow is solar, and then everything above the black line, which is load, is curtailment. So what do we see here? We see that nuclear is flat across the entire day. We also see that large hydro is pretty flat. We see imports dramatically ramp down and then ramp up again, much more so than thermal resources. But these, of course, also ramp up toward the end of the day. We also see something pretty intuitive, which is that during the solar hours where we see curtailment. Wind is there pretty consistently across the entire day. You could even see a little bit that it's helping with the ramp up, but it's the solar that really is pushing, it's the solar hours that really push up the curtailment. So if we want to decrease curtailment, there's only a couple things we can do. We could shift load, you could use storage, and you can increase load during the middle of the day during curtailment hours, and you could decrease it at other times during the peaks. And then you could try and get the renewables below that net load line, the generation, below that net load line, to be more price responsive. You could see that some are really doing their part, but perhaps aren't doing it enough during the ramping hours. Let's go through one by one. You'll see interties during the ramp up and ramp down hours. And some, they're still scheduling in 5,000 megawatts while there's curtailing. It would be a good policy, I think, to try and get them to be more price responsive. Then the next contributor to self-scheduled or physically inflexible capacity is large hydro. It's about 3,000 megawatts across the entire day. We then see nuclear, which we know a big portion of or all of is going away in 2024. And that's, over 2,000 megawatts. And then we see thermal generation, and that's, 750 to 1,000 megawatts, depending on when the curtailment is. There's been a lot of focus on thermal generation, and that's not necessarily intuitive from looking at this one day. But over time and on other days, you'll see that thermal generation makes up a bigger portion of the resource fleet. And it's in particular, here it looks very price responsive, but as you get more and more thermal generation online, you end up having what's called a P-min burden. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So here's some low-hanging fruit on some policies that I think would just almost immediately make oversupply less of an issue. I think you could lower the energy bid floor, and I could probably do a 6-hour talk on the implications of lowering the energy bid floor and why you want to do this. But I'm just going to say very briefly, it would make it more painful to import during negative hours. And when you charge people to import, eventually they're going to adjust their contracts or they're going to make their resources more flexible. There really isn't much else I could think to incent imports, to make them respond to prices, if not lowering the energy bid floor and making things more negative. I also think increasing EIM participation will help. The CAISO is already doing this, so that's great. And then there's always forecast improvements. And they're always looking for ways to improve the short-term forecast. And this is just an important thing to note because I think they should get kudos for really just grabbing this low-hanging fruit and improving their forecasting methods. What's a little bit more complex to talk about are longer-term policy goals. So making strategic improvements in the current thermal fleet is something that the CAISO has been trying to do for years. It's well known that the CAISO is looking for thermal generation with high flexibility and a low P-min burden. So this is the idea that if you need to keep a resource online during high solar hours or potential oversupply conditions, because you're going to need it later for the high ramping period, this idea that it has to stay online and it has to stay online at a minimum value, that's called a P-min burden. I wanted to state a quote from Mark Rothleader because I thought it was great, and I thought it illustrated that there were some really creative solutions that people were coming out with to really modify the thermal fleet. So Mark is the VP at the California ISO, and he's the one in charge of renewable integration. So he was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and this is what he said. As we navigate the transition to a 100% renewable future, we need the gas fleet to become faster and more flexible, lower minimum load level, short startups, like what Edison did with their EGTs by adding batteries to their peakers. We need more solutions like that. So I'm not sure everyone in the audience knew what Mark was talking about, but what he's talking about is what SCE did, and they had a peaker, and they added a battery to the peaker itself. This is different than simply having a battery and peaker share an interconnection. This was creating a hybrid resource that really improved the flexibility of the peaker. It went from having a Pmin of about 10% of its Pmax capacity to 0. So now that peaker can sit on the system, it can provide spinning reserves, it can provide all these ancillary services, and there's no Pmin burden. At the same time, the battery peaker pair, the hybrid, also has almost an instantaneous ramp rate. It can ramp very quickly, and it could do this even starting from a 0 Pmin and with a very quick startup time. So really, it could start up in, I think within 5 minutes. So in one interval, you could say, hey, generate in the next interval. So I think this is a very creative solution. We looked at this a little bit. Gridwell did just an initial report on what happens if you add hybrid EGTs to the grid. So if you're interested in this technology, please check it out or email me. We looked at Wellhead's technology. They're the ones who did the SCE unit. So I think making these strategic improvements will be really important. And also note, these improvements cost money. You don't necessarily need to add a battery to a peaker. There are ways to lower your Pmin or increase your ramp rate, but the ways to do this all mean upgrading your systems and making some mechanical changes. So unless the CAISO market provides incentives or somehow the resource adequacy structure provides incentives, resources aren't going to do this on their own. So for those of you who know me, you may be surprised that I have not talked about resource adequacy. For those of you who don't know me, I wrote a lot of the resource adequacy rules at the California ISO, only the good ones. And my consulting company now does a lot with resource adequacy, and we help firms with that. The reason why I didn't talk about that is because I think that we're at a pause moment for resource adequacy. This really, RA and flexible RA is on hold until we make these larger market improvements. So I don't think it's particularly topical. That said, if you're interested in flexible RA, I am happy to talk about it. So please give me a call or shoot me an email. But that's not included in any of these longer term policy goals. So the next one I want to talk about has to do with EIM. And just so you guys know, this is my almost final slide. So I think another long-term policy consideration is extending the day-ahead market to EIM entities, and maybe someday, although it'll probably be a while, regionalizing completely. And then the next thing is, I think the CAISO could enhance their day-ahead market and add a flexible ramping product to create all those incentives that I just talked about. So that's my webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want more information, please email Callie or I. We'd be happy to talk to you. If you're interested in Energy GPS's newsletters or products, I have a link here. You could also call in for our next webinar. I think I'm going to focus more on EIM, and then I'm going to talk about lowering the bid floor in a little bit more depth. At that time, I'll also talk about wind, solar, and battery optimal bidding examples based on their contract type. This is a question that I've gotten from a few people, and it was a direct request for this webinar. And it was just walking through these examples are a little tedious, and it also takes a lot of time. So I don't want a very long webinar. But on the next one, I will walk through these, and there's definitely a direct connection between the benefits of lowering the bid floor and these different resources by contract type. So I'll get into that a lot more. Okay, so right now I'll just take some questions.